Sometimes I ask myself, why do these things happen? Why is such depravity so prevalent? But questions like those can be dangerous, unhealthy. It will send you for a loop. But there is a fine line between the obsessive thoughts chipping away at your soul and looking at what we have, the evidence, the stories, the cases. One such case, a really fucked up one, originated in Florida, Charlotte County. The year was 1994. Two hunters were making their way down the Hog Trail in Charlotte County, Florida. The date was February 1st, 1994, and to these men it was just another hunting trip. Shoot some hogs, get a little excitement, and go home. But the two raised their eyebrows somewhat when they spotted a gathering of buzzards circling over an area ahead of the two hunters. They knew something had attracted the flying scavengers, and considering the fact that they were on the hog trail, they thought a dead hog must be laying in the remote area. But when they made their way to the location, they saw something else. It was dead alright, but it didn't look like a hog. No, it was a human being, rotting, decomposing along the hog trail. The men immediately contacted police, and the police descended upon the trail. The dead man would never be identified, and he had been laying there for over a month, but the medical examiners could conclude a few things. He was a white man, between 25 and 30 years old. His cause of death had been strangulation, but that wasn't all. He had been mutilated. His dick and his balls had been cut off post-mortem. This man, this John Doe, had ran into someone dangerous, and the danger was far from over. Many serial killers with a preference for sexual sadism hunt and kill women. We all know about them. I have covered many of them myself. Melvin Reese, the Golden State Killer, Anders Eklund, Vlado Taneski, Metal Fang, and there's always the famous one, Ted fucking Bundy. But if you thought your dick made you immune to being hunted, you are sorely mistaken, because just like we have our lipstick killers and Ted Bundys of the world, we have our John Wayne Gacy's, Jeffrey Dahmers, and Hog Trail killers of the world. 2 years passed by. The mutilated, unnamed body had pretty much been forgotten, or at the very least written off as an isolated incident. It was on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1996, and a man was sitting on his porch in Northport, Florida. His dog was loose and running around doing things dogs do, but dogs are curious creatures in a way, or, as a former dog owner myself, they love their bones. The man saw his dog run towards him with something in his mouth. A little curious, the man looked at the dog, but as it got closer he was horrified. The dog was biting down on a human skull. Panicked, the man contacted police, and once again, police descended upon a grisly scene. The victim had been chopped up. Arm bones, leg bones, and a pelvis was found scattered about. They also found a complete rib cage. The body was too decomposed to determine exactly how he had died, but one thing could be determined. Whoever killed this man had also cut his genitals off. This victim was never identified, another John Doe found along the hog trails. Mutilated, degraded, murdered. Something was wrong, very wrong. There was a predator lurking, and he was far from finished. Only 2 months went by this time. A man was driving down a road along the hog trails when he felt the pressure. He desperately had to take a piss. He pulled over and stepped outside, emptying his bladder onto the ground beneath him. But there was something in the undergrowth. The stream of piss was hitting something weird. No need to guess what it was. It was a human body, dead and decomposing. The man panicked and contacted police. Another John Doe. Police were getting worried. It couldn't be a coincidence. The man they found dead this time had only been dead for about 10 days and had been strangled to death. And his genitals had been cut off with surgical-like precision. The victim would 3 years later be identified as William John Malaragno. He had suffered a horrifying fate, like a scene out of a slasher film, only this wasn't a film, it was real. He ran through the woods naked and panicked in an attempt to flee his attacker. He had been running for his life, racing through the woods barefoot, cutting his feet on sharp rocks, and hurling himself through underbrushes, something that scratched up his upper torso badly. But it didn't matter. Eventually his attacker caught up with him and stabbed him 4 times before finishing him off. The killer then positioned his body in a cross-like position on the ground and removed his genitals. But how did William Malaragno end up in the woods naked in the first place? Well, the killer had a very specific way of obtaining his victims. He would approach transients and desperate men, proposing to give them money if he could take nude photos of them. But he had a fetish, a specific fetish. He would tie the victim to a tree very tightly, and he would rape them and perform oral sex on them before strangling them and remove their genitals. It's theorized he removed the dick and balls to not leave saliva on the body, but it's also theorized that it was a big part of his fantasy. Personally, I don't see why it couldn't be both. Regardless, the killer was truly a sick fucking individual. Richard Montgomery would be the key. His death would be the catalyst that pointed police in the direction of Daniel Conahan. But the price he paid was high, the ultimate sacrifice. Richard was an outcast. He hanged out with his friends a lot in the trailer park where he lived, and there they would play Dungeons and Dragons all night long. It said that Richard would do anything for money or alcohol. He was a heavy drinker and he had a criminal rap sheet for assault, burglary, and grand theft auto. He was also a drug user, a man with many vices, and so young, only 21 years old. It was on April 16, 1996 that Richard's friends saw him for the last time. He was in a good mood and told his friends that he was off to make $300. Easy money, he thought. All he needed was to let a man take nude photos of him. He was never seen alive again. A few days earlier, Richard had told his mother of an opportunity to make some money. He just had to pose nude in progressive stages of bondage. He never told her who the man offering the money was, but he told her of a new friend he had met. His name was Daniel Conahan, and he was a nurse. On that day, Richard Montgomery made his way towards the lumber yard, where he had set up with Daniel Conahan to be picked up. Daniel Conahan had stopped by a Walmart before meeting with Richard. He had only withdrawn $40, but then again, he didn't intend on paying the young man. He bought rope, cutting pliers, and a razor-sharp knife. Then the two drove into the woods by the Hog Trail, where Daniel Conahan tied Richard Montgomery to the tree. At some point, the young man must have realized that this wasn't just a photo shoot. Richard was raped as the bindings dug into his skin, and then Daniel Conahan put the rope around his neck and with the help of the tree strangled the man to death, slowly and surely painfully. Afterwards, he cut off the now dead young man's genitals and wrapped him in a sort of a grey carpet. On April 17, just one day after the murder of Richard Montgomery, two road workers needed a break. They decided to take a walk along the Hog Trail. While doing so, they found a human head. It was rotting and decomposing. Panicked, they contacted police, and they for the fourth time descended upon madness. It was magic realism, surreal. The decomposed head belonged to 25-year-old Kenneth Smith. He had been the fourth victim in the Hog Trail murders, but as police searched the area for the missing body parts of Kenneth Smith, they stumbled upon something else. They had been looking for Kenneth Smith's remains, but instead they found the fresh corpse of Richard Montgomery. He had only been dead for a day, and the strangle marks were still visible on his throat. The number of victims had only been at 4 for a few hours, now it was 5. 5 dead victims. 5 male bodies given to the hog trails of Florida. There was no question about it anymore. They definitively had a serial killer on their hands. Now they had to catch him. But how? The findings had sent Charlotte County into a panic. The papers were running headlines and everyone was talking about the Hog Trail killings. Eventually, the media circus reached the Glades Correctional Facility. David Payton was an inmate and reported to police that he had a strange encounter with a man named Daniel Conahan in 1995. He had been offered drugs and alcohol by the man, and once inside the car, he was offered $100 to pose for a nude photograph. He declined the offer, and the driver, Daniel Conahan, kept driving. But he was driving the wrong way. He was heading deeper into the woods, and David Payton started to panic. Lucky for him though, the car got stuck in the mud and a motorist stopped to help them push the vehicle. But David Payton could feel that something was wrong, so as the tire got loose, he quickly sat down in front of the wheel of Daniel Conahan's car and drove away, leaving Daniel Conahan stranded on the road. Daniel Conahan and his father picked up the car a day later at the police impound. Police were intrigued by the story, but David Payton was a habitual liar. They needed more to go on about this man before doing anything. As they looked into it more though, they found 2 complaints made about Daniel Conahan, and it's when they found the third that they knew. Their instincts, their gut, told them that they had found him. The man who would become a key witness was Stanley Burden, a degenerate pedophile who served 10 to 25 years in prison for molesting a child. A chomo, as Sean Atwood would say. Stanley told police that he had been offered $150 by a man named Dan to pose nude in bondage positions. Stanley accepted and was tied to a tree. That's when he realized how dumb he had been. He was raped, and once he had been raped, the man he knew as Dan attempted to strangle him. He wrapped the rope around Stanley's throat and tried to strangle him against the tree for about 30 minutes. But Stanley struggled against the rope, and after such long time, Daniel Conahan simply gave up. He offered Stanley Burden money to keep quiet about the incident, and Stanley did. Regardless of credibility, Daniel Conahan had gotten enough complaints from isolated sources. He was propped up to the top of the list of suspects. A long surveillance period followed. For 50 days police surveilled Daniel Conahan, around the clock non-stop. They always had eyes on the man. They were working hard to catch this man. The multi-agency task force set up fake homeless camps and dressed several undercover officers as gay transients. Hoping one of them would be approached by Daniel Conahan, their undercover officers were approached by Daniel Conahan as he proposed to give them money in exchange to having them pose nude in the woods, so that he could take pictures of them. Police had mobile tracking device on his car, 24-hour aerial surveillance, video cameras in his house, and every time he left his house, they had 6 cars following him. They were determined to catch him. They only needed time and enough evidence. On one occasion, a meeting had been set up with an undercover officer and Daniel Conahan. It was to take place in the woods. As the undercover officer was meeting with Daniel to negotiate sex, police were sitting by, watching. There were police everywhere in the trees and on the ground, all out of sight. A small army of officers, all pointing their guns at Daniel Conahan's head. If Daniel had done something that day, if he had acted violent towards the undercover officer, there wouldn't have been any trial. He would have been sprayed with bullets. And maybe he should have. Police also had to interrupt attempts made by Daniel at least 2 times. Police spotted Daniel Conahan approach people, transients, homeless men, and considered the situation to be dangerous for the potential victim. They sent in marked police cars to break it up. It was now the end of May 1996, and police tracking Daniel Conahan decided to stop him. He had broken some law, but that wasn't the reason they had acted. They brought him into a hotel room that had been set up with video cameras for interrogation. They wanted to see how he would react at being confronted. Police began conducting an interrogation inside the hotel room. While interrogating him, police officers conducted a search warrant for his house and his vehicle. Daniel Conahan was nervous. He was chain-smoking and just answered questions by saying things like, "Oh my gosh, why me? What brought you to me?" A red flag, because he seemed very interested in knowing what evidence they had, what they had seen, what they had found out. Before letting him leave the hotel room, a police officer looked Daniel Conahan in the eyes and stated, "Right now, you're a suspect." Conahan responded with a forced, "Whoa! Wow!" before he left. A little over a month later, he was arrested. The reason Montgomery was the key was because he was the link, the physical link to Daniel Conahan. Fibers matching the carpet in Daniel Conahan's car was found on his body, and leather matching Conahan's gloves were found on the tree that Montgomery had been strangled on. The trial was long, and Daniel Conahan has never stated his guilt, but it was over for him. In 1997, the decomposed body of another murdered man was found. He had been there for a very long time, and he too had his genitals removed. The 6th had been found. Police also looked into 4 murders that had occurred in Chicago before 1993, because Daniel Conahan had been living there before moving to Florida. They bore very similar signs of mutilation and MO, but ultimately, they couldn't be tied to the Hog Trail killer. Daniel Conahan was sentenced to death in 1999. He currently remains on death row. He still claims that he's innocent. The case of the Hog Trail killings is one among many. The fucked up things that went down in the Florida woods in the mid-90s is in a way unexplainable. Sure, you could say it was sexual motivation, and it sure was. But that can't be all there is to it. Or is it really that simple? Sometimes I ask myself, why do these things happen?